Well, first I must apologize for missing the entire week of classes. I was unwell. I'm still not feeling all the way okay, so if I don't last through until 12:30, you must forgive me. In any event, I didn't wish to lose more time than we already have. It will be necessary now to do some compression in order to catch up with the schedule of topics. And today I want to deal both with Wahhabism and with some of the early administrative political reforms in the Ottoman state in the late 18th and early 19th century. To begin with, Wahhabism, which is a phenomenon well known by name. Recently in particular, because of events which do not need to be named by me in detail, Wahhabism has become the chosen target of many half-baked TV commentators. And as you will gather from my treatment of the subject, I also do not regard Wahhabism as being a particularly fruitful or important school of thought within Islam. And it's with some reluctance that I find myself, at least circumstantially, in the company of neoconservatives and Zionists, for whom Wahhabism is a kind of quintessence of all they dislike. Of course, since I've embarked on this polemical digression, the fact is that depending on the precise a set of circumstances in the Middle East, there will be one or other expression of Islam that is regarded as the source of all evil. At the time of the revolution in Iran, of course, it was Shiism. And then the notoriety of Shiism was reinforced by the activities of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the focus may shift again. In any event, we do find it necessary to speak of Wahhabism, its first emergence and subsequent development in the context of the 18th century. The founder of Wahhabism is, of course, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab. From whom the name has taken Wahhabism. Those that follow this school might object that Wahhabism is an unacceptable designation, in that they see their understanding of Islam to be the sole, unique, authentic, correct understanding of Islam, and not therefore the work of a single individual. And indeed, as we shall see, the early Wahhabis in particular regarded all who did not subscribe to their particular tenets as being non-Muslim. I do not see any reason to grant to the Wahhabis this assumption of a monopoly of the correct understanding of Islam, and therefore I will follow the convention of calling the Wahhabis Wahhabis. However, in passing, let us note that from their own point of view, they are simply the Muslims, or in some cases they define themselves as Ahl al-Tawheed, the people of divine oneness, which again, of course, is a self-description that all Muslims will claim for themselves, and nothing particularly distinctive for Wahhabis. People of the divine oneness. Now, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab is the third among the figures from 18th century Muslim history that we have been dealing with. Remember, we have discussed Shah Waliullah Dehlavi of India, and then somewhat more recently, Sheikh Osman Danfodio of Hausaland in West Africa. And often the assumption is made, because of the the chronological overlap between these three personalities, that they all, despite certain variations in emphasis and local circumstance, were pursuing roughly the same goals. In other words, that they all fall under that heading of tajdeed, of renewal, of reform, of criticism of the intellectual and spiritual legacy, a desire for political strengthening, and so forth. Now, we've seen that despite certain important differences, Shah Waliullah, Dehlavi, and Usman Danfodio do indeed fall more or less under that heading. In other words, they both are or claim to be mujaddids, renewers of the given century in which they were active. And in so doing, they drew on a long history in both regions. However, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab does not claim to be a mujaddid. And moreover, while the mujaddid must be recognized as such by a significant number of his contemporaries or near contemporaries, failing which the claim falls flat, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab, far from finding acclaim from the contemporary religious scholars, was on the contrary condemned by the great majority among them. In other words, one may say that within the overall context of the 18th century, he and his movement must be seen as an anomaly and as an exception, not as one more illustration of the pattern of tajdeed, of which I've given two examples. Another clarification that may be made is why include Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab and Wahhabism at all in a course on Islamic political thought. Because, in other words, underlying the question might be this, that Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab did not set forth any system of thought. In fact, you might say he demonstrates a certain enmity to the processes of thought as somehow irreligious in themselves. And still less does he have any codified political thought. However, it is also beyond doubt that his movement gave rise to a state, to a political organism, namely Saudi Arabia, which came into being and for long was simply the political, military, institutional expression of Wahhabism. So it is justified from that point of view to include some discussion of him in our course. Also, although the intellectual impact of Wahhabism in its immediate emergence was extremely slight, its military political significance was of some importance. As we shall see, it emerged, the Wahhabi movement emerged in Arabia at a time when the Ottomans were under attack on a number of fronts. And it underlined for the Ottomans the state of weakness, political military weakness that they deemed to need correction. It is not that they took to heart Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab's condemnation of them as false or deficient Muslims. However, they did take to heart the fact that their weakness in a key area, the Arabian Peninsula, was demonstrated in a clear and undeniable fashion. So, all of this in general about Wahhabism. To begin, obviously enough, with a biographical sketch. He was born in the year 1115 of the Islamic era, 1703, Christian, in a small town of Ayayna, Najd. Najd being the northeastern portion of the present-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Najd had not been a traditional center of Islamic scholarship. Unlike Mughal India and Hausaland, the respective homelands of the two previous figures we've discussed, each of which was a traditional stronghold of Islamic learning, the same was not the case with Najd. It is, after all, an extremely barren area, lacking in economic resources, at least until the discovery of oil, and not lying on any of the main trading routes. This being the case, urban life was there at a minimum, and very few authors, scholars of significance can be identified in Najd. His father was the Qadi of Najd. I'm sorry, of Al-Uyayna. His father, the father of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab, is the Qadi, the judge of Al-Uyayna. And he exercised that office in accordance with the Hanbali school of law. Many of you will be aware that in Sunni Islam there are 4 separate schools of jurisprudence, and that which is generally characterized as the most conservative is the Hanbali school. Like most brief characterizations, it's not that helpful. And particularly when one takes into consideration the fact that Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab was, in terms of his background, Hanbali, it is liable to give rise to certain false assumptions. That he was, in his, for want of a better word, extreme conservatism, simply following or developing a characteristic of the Hanbali madhab. However, once he launched himself on his career of universal denunciation of all who disagreed with him, the Hanbali scholars, both of Najd and of other parts of the Muslim world, formed part of the consensus that rejected his claims as false and as dangerous. And indeed, his father and his brother were among his 2 earliest opponents. Initially, it seems, the father of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab regarded him with some kind of paternal pride or indulgence, but after a while, as the official Saudi chronicle puts it, words occurred between the 2 of them, and a break took place. As for his brother, Sulaiman ibn Abd-al-Wahhab, he was one of the earliest to write a treatise in refutation of what came to be known as Wahhabism. So, even against this background of adherence to the Hanbali school, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab must be regarded as a deviant, or to put it more neutrally, a new departure. Already in his youth, it seems that Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab was going around the small town of Al-Uyayna denouncing what he regarded as deviations from true Islam, as indulgence in polytheism. The list, of course, of what, from the point of view of Wahhabism, constitutes polytheism, deviation from the monotheistic worship, is extraordinarily long. But what was initially at issue for Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab in Uyayna was the practice, universal then throughout the Muslim world, of making devotions at, but not to, the tombs of saints. An important distinction, making devotions at, not to, the tombs of saints. This was, and of course still, to some degree still is, a universal form of worship. A worship undertaken in that location in the belief that the sacred personage buried in the tomb would in some way reinforce the power of one's petitionary prayer. He is not in any sense the object or the recipient of the prayer, merely one who, as it were, reinforces it in the hope of gaining greater divine acceptance. In any event, in the year 1139, 1726, the father of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab was dismissed from his post as Qadi and obliged to leave for the nearby town of Khuraymila, also in Najd. And there too, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab went on the rampage, denouncing the citizens of the town for sins they had been unaware of. And then, despairing of his program of reform, left to perform the Hajj. He spent 4 years then in Medina. And we know the names of some of the scholars with whom he studied. Some of those scholars are the same who had been in contact with Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. And this coincidence has strengthened the assumption that there is a basic commonality between Shah Waliullah Dehlavi and Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab. This in fact cannot in any way be assumed. After all, teachers have a wide variety of different students, and they do not impose a uniform outlook upon them. While in Medina, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab spent a considerable amount of time studying the works of Ibn Taymiyyah. And some kind of antecedent, historical antecedent from his teachings we saw, it can, to some degree, and again with considerable reservation, be found in the work of Ibn Taymiyyah. Excuse me. Ibn Taymiyyah had lived in the Mongol period. He died in the year 1328, and also manifested a great delight in polemical refutation of those whom he regarded as deviating from the correct practice of Islam. And there are some similarities indeed with the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab. An important difference to note, however, between the two figures, and there are more as well, is that Ibn Taymiyyah, although he took issue with certain dimensions of Sufism, was himself a Sufi. He was himself an initiate of the Qadiri order, that same order that we've already evoked in connection with Sheikh Osman Dan Fodio. Whereas Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab rejected Sufism in total as an unauthorized innovation without any place in Islam. From Medina, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab moved back to Huraymala, where his father was still living, and from there went to the city of Basra in southern Iraq, settling in a village, the name of which I will not trouble you with. It is probable that there for the first time he had contact with Shi'i Muslims. There is an area of the Arabian Peninsula known as Al-Ahsa, which now forms part of the major oil producing area, which borders on Najd. But as far as we know, there was no Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab never visited Al-Ahsa while he was living in Najd. He never visited that Shi'i area while living in Najd. And it was only when he came to Basra, an area which then, as now, had a predominantly Shi'i population, that he made the direct acquaintance of Shi'ism. And given what has already been said, it will not be surprising that Shia Islam now became one of the principal targets of his hostility. From Basra, he, according to one account, traveled to Baghdad and spent a number of years there, even studying in Iran, which was of course the homeland of Shi'ism. There are, however, various legendary aspects to the account that places him in Baghdad. It's more likely that he went back to Huraymala, joined up with his father again, except that finally his father got tired of him and closed the door on him with instructions not to knock. And thereafter he was on his own. It seems that it is now that he compiled a little book called Kitab al-Tawheed, the book of divine oneness. If you look at the book, it is in fact nothing other than a collection of hadith. In other words, there is no authorial activity involved. He simply gathered together a number of hadith illustrating the theme of Tawheed, of the divine oneness. Because of the very slight nature of his literary output, later scholars sympathetic to Wahhabism, who have printed his works, have engaged in what they call tawsiyah, expansion. In other words, they fill it out a little to make it look somewhat more impressive. And this makes it difficult to separate what he said, if anything, in addition to the hadith. What he did say seems to be minimal. And the significance is rather his choice of hadith and the conclusions that he seems to have drawn practically from these hadith. Why the concentration on Tawheed? Because of his conviction that the great majority of Muslims had strayed from the path of Tawheed and effectively become mushrik. These are, of course, key terms. Tawheed and its negative counterpart, shirk, which is generally translated as polytheism, for want of a better word, except that the sense of it is somewhat broader. In other words, even without assuming there to be a multiplicity of gods, it is possible for a person to be engaged in shirk. Shirk literally means the assignation of a partner to God through assigning to other than God any of his distinctive attributes. So shirk is the abstract noun, and the personal noun is mushrik, the one who engages or is held to engage in such activity. It is on this pair of opposites that Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab's attention is concentrated. In 1153, 1740, his father dies, and all trace of restraint is now removed from him. He had earlier said that mere preaching alone is not enough. It is necessary to pass over into action. And once his father had died, then all restraint was removed, and he sought an environment from which he could launch an armed campaign to impose by force his own vision of how things ought to be. Initially, he went from Huraymila back to Al-Uyayna, his birthplace. And the local ruler, whose name I will not trouble you with, gave him his protection and promised him armed support. And at the same time, he gave him in marriage his own art. So a marital link came into being now between him and the ruling house. And now Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab began his career, his active career, shall we say, by cutting down some trees, which supposedly the object of some local veneration. And then he moved on to the destruction of the tomb of one of the companions of the Prophet, who had died in one of the early battles of Islam. The tomb in itself was seen to be objectionable, in that it was a focus of popular attention. As far as one knows, people did not make petitionary prayers at the tomb of this companion. Nonetheless, the existence of the tomb, surmounted by a dome, was thought to be somehow offensive. And it's very remarkable that even in much later times, the Saudi ulama, Saudi or Wahhabi ulama, have been very insistent on the destruction of domes over covering the tombs of the dead. On the other hand, they've had nothing much to say about the skyscrapers that the Saudi family has erected at a much higher elevation than the modest domes over the tombs of the deceased. So this was a good start from his point of view. Some trees got cut down and a couple of domes were destroyed. But what really put him on the map was when he personally stoned to death a woman who had allegedly engaged in adultery. This event is recorded in the official chronicle of the Saudi Wahhabi cause as follows. It says, thereafter his cause flourished, his power increased, and true Tawheed was everywhere disseminated. Just when things seemed to be going so well for him, the local politics in Al-Uyayna changed, and he was obliged to leave the city. But in fact, this apparent setback was extremely beneficial. He went to the city of Al-Dir'iyah, concluding a new alliance with none other than the eponym of the Saudi family, Muhammad ibn Saud, and again sealed it with a marriage. This alliance, of course, has proved permanent. Yeah. Let me see. Timeline. 1157, 1744. Yeah, 1157, 1744. So now a new and more permanent alliance came into being between Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab and the Saudi family. And one can say that until maybe the close of the 19th century, the sole raison d'etre of the Saudi state was to act as the military and political arm of the Wahhabi ideology. Later, of course, as we shall see, however briefly, other factors entered the picture, first British patronage and then American patronage, causing a gradual partial dissolution of the traditional tie between the Wahhabi establishment and the Saudi family. In the beginnings, however, the origin of the Saudi state is inseparable from its enrollment in the cause of Wahhabism. Muhammad ibn Saud pledged his aid to Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab to wage jihad against all who deviated from his understanding of Tawheed. He had, however, some initial hesitation because part of the package of deviations that Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab discerned was the levying of certain taxes that were not to be found in the Sharia, not to be found in Islamic religious law. However, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab assured him that once they set forth on their campaign of so-called jihad across the Arabian Peninsula, the resulting booty would by far exceed the pitiful amount of taxation he'd been levying locally, which indeed was the case. The formal proclamation of jihad came in 1159, 1746. One can say that this is the first time in Islamic history that one group of Muslims makes a formal proclamation of jihad against all other Muslims. Of course, the theme of jihad was often invoked in sectarian disputes. For example, when the Ottomans and the Safavids went to war, The Ottomans would call it jihad. Why? Because the Safavids, the Shia, were allegedly heretic. And sometimes the Safavids would return the compliment also. When they went to war, they would say this is jihad. But this is a different matter from proclaiming oneself the exclusive custodian of Islam as such, and all who deviate as non-Muslim, and therefore subject to jihad. I will talk later about the reaction of the Ottomans to the rise of the Wahhabi movement. But we may remark already that from the Ottoman point of view, what was now underway did indeed have certain parallels in earlier Islamic history. Above all, the Kharijites, those of you who took this class last semester may remember them. The Kharijites were that group in early Islam who indeed regarded those beyond their own community as effectively non-Muslim. In the course of this campaign of jihad, first the entirety of Najd was captured. Then the tribes of Central Arabia came under Wahhabi control. Then the region of Asir on the Red Sea coast and parts of the Yemen. Muhammad ibn Saud, the founder of the Saudi family, died in 1766, and was then succeeded by one of his numerous sons, Abd-al-Aziz, who took up the campaign with great vigor, and in 1773, conquered what is still today the Saudi capital of Riyadh. Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab himself was, of course, still on the scene, and he wished to proceed directly to Mecca in order to have his claims accepted by the scholars of the city. He sent a 30-man delegation, but the delegation returned empty-handed. They found objectionable the cardinal principle of the Wahhabis that every non-Wahhabi must be condemned as a non-Muslim. And from this point of view, frustrated and unsuccessful, Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab died in 1206, 1791. The campaigns continued, and it will be tedious to list for you all of its stages. However, one particularly worthwhile, one event particularly worth mentioning is the conquest of Karbala in southern Iraq in the year 1216, i.e. 1217, 1802. 1217, 1802. Karbala, of course, then is now one of the principal places of visitation of Shi'i Muslims. And the especially intense venom of the Wahhabis towards the Shia appears clearly enough in the account given of the conquest of Karbala. The chronicle that I've quoted more than once says the following. In the year 1216, Saud, that is the son of Abd-al-Aziz, set out with his divinely supported army and cavalry that he had recruited from the city dwellers and nomads of Najd from the south and elsewhere. He made for Karbala and began hostilities against the people of the city of Al-Hussein, Imam al-Hussein being buried in Karbala. The Muslims scaled the walls. The Muslims, that means the Wahhabis. The Muslims scaled the walls, entered the city by force, and killed the majority of its people in the markets and in their homes. Then they destroyed the dome placed over the grave of Al-Hussein. They took whatever they found inside the dome and its surroundings. They took everything they found in the town, different types of property, weapons, clothing, carpets, gold, silver, copies of the Quran, as well as much else, more than can be enumerated, and so on. Notice that this is not the account of a hostile source. It is not a polemical account written, shall we say, by a survivor of the massacre. It is, on the contrary, spelled out clearly enough in a chronicle that continues to be reprinted in Saudi Arabia down to the present as the history of the early Wahhabi movement. Let me move forward now to the end of the early Wahhabi movement. The Wahhabis did ultimately come to the Hijaz and take possession of the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. This was no longer a matter that could be ignored by the Ottomans. From the point of view of the Ottomans, disturbances in barren, remote areas of the Arabian Peninsula was not particularly threatening, what had happened in Najd or in Central Arabia. The Hijaz, however, was a different matter, since among the numerous titles of the Ottoman sultans was the title servant of the two sacred mosques, Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain. And the Ottomans could hardly, therefore, allow the two mosques, Makkah and Medina, to remain under Wahhabi occupation. The fact of the matter was, however, that at the very same time, the Ottomans were confronted with two other problems. One, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, and then a continuing warfare with the Russians on their northern front. And they were no longer able to muster forces to deal decisively with what was happening in the south, in Arabia. Initially, they delegated the task of liberating the Hijaz to the governor of Basra, to the Ottoman governor of Basra. However, he proved unable to do it. Instead, the task was delegated to the governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha. Muhammad Ali Pasha was an important figure in the history of state reform and strengthening in the Middle East. Nominally the Ottoman viceroy in Egypt, he was in fact an independent ruler, one in fact of great power and vigor. And without too much difficulty, he was able to cross from Egypt, cross the Red Sea, and within the space of less than a year, to remove the Wahhabis, Saudis, from Medina and from Mecca, and then to chase them across the desert to their stronghold in Najd. So that by the year 1234, 1819, the first Wahhabi Saudi state was brought to an end. Two of the grandsons of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab were executed, and also the reigning head of the Saudi family, Abdullah ibn Saud, was sent to Istanbul, where he too was executed. This is the, in a fairly short form, the origin of the Wahhabi Saudi state. There are two things to be emphasized. Firstly, that the ideological impact of Wahhabism was negligible. This can be overlooked, given the general tendency to conflate it with other 18th century reform movements. And also, once various types of Muslim, of religious-inspired resistance to the European rule began, shall we say, in India, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, the colonial authorities were very quick to label these movements, for whatever reason, as Wahhabi. With very few exceptions, they were not. Now, however, making use of that mislabeling undertaken by the colonial authorities, Saudi historians of Wahhabism point to all kinds of movements and places and saying, yes, Wahhabism had already in the 18th century, 18th, 19th century, an important impact. The fact of the matter is that it did not. Then the second thing to note is that the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab remained uncodified for a very long time. There is no positive content. It is a question really of identifying things as real or imagined symptoms of shirk. There is no, as it were, comprehensive, positive understanding of an Islamic worldview, including the political. The resurgence of the Saudi Wahhabi state comes, of course, at a very much later time under the auspices of the British. During the First World War, the British subsidized both the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis, and also the rulers of the Hijaz. And part of the aftermath of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman state is the emergence in the Arabian Peninsula of the Saudi state, which is with us still today. Finally, one other clarification. I hope I'm not getting too incoherent. One other clarification. In what way did the self-appointed mission of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab differ from that of the Mujaddid? The Mujaddid has as the core of his mission the uprooting of bid'ah, the uprooting of innovation, of unauthorized innovation, and the restoration of the Sunnah. From using slightly different terminology, then Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab says that he is waging a war against shirk and is restoring tawheed. What is the difference between them? Firstly, that from the point of view of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab, the entirety of Islamic history, essentially from the 3rd century onwards, had been a mistake. Any development subsequent to the 3rd century of the Hijrah was, from his point of view, to be rejected. For example, the entirety of scholastic theology, the entirety of Sufism, most developments of the various schools of law, all of this was to be rejected. Whereas, from a more realistic and more moderate perspective, the Mujaddid says that damage, decay takes place, indeed, every 100 years, and has to be repaired at the end of every 100 years. But from the point of view of Muhammad ibn Abd-al-Wahhab, it was as if there had never been a Mujaddid, there had never been any renewal since the 3rd century of the Islamic era. And so it was he who alone was now in a position to restore what he regarded as true Islam. That much for Wahhabism. Now let me pass on to the well, he wanted to accommodate the compilation of the 6 books of Sunni Hadith, and if he'd broken off earlier, then he would have had to, forego some of the books. Now, what was happening in the Ottoman state at this time? I've already referred in several connections to the growing military weakness. A whole series of military defeats were suffered by the Ottomans during the 18th century, accompanied inevitably by territorial loss. And insofar as there was any impact of Wahhabism on the structure of the Ottoman state, it was only political and military. The same Muhammad Ali Pasha, on whom they had depended to liberate the Hijaz from the Wahhabis, they called upon again in 1824 in order to crush a rebellion in southern Greece. And not surprisingly, Muhammad Ali Pasha, and followed by his son Ibrahim Pasha, got the idea that if they were so indispensable to the Ottomans, then they might as well have a try at capturing the caliphate and central power itself. So that in 1832 we find Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali, mounting a successful campaign through Palestine and Syria, coming even into central Anatolia. He's not stopped before he gets to Konya, which is right in the center of Anatolia. So this was very painful under indication to the Ottomans that their military weakness was threatening not simply outlying provinces in Europe, in the Balkans, but the very heartland of the state in Anatolia. We can pick up the chronology usefully with the reign of Sultan Selim III, Selim S-E-L-I-M, who ruled from 1789 to 1807. Interestingly enough, there were attempts made to portray Sultan Selim himself as a mujaddid. You see how pervasive and ubiquitous the concept is. Now not a scholar, not a religious scholar, but rather a reigning sultan is portrayed as a mujaddid. And it seems that Selim liked the idea. He certainly didn't say no, that I am not the mujaddid. He was indeed a man of wide talents and interests, not to be compared with his infamous predecessor, Selim II, known as Selim the Sot. He is one of the foremost composers of Ottoman classical music. He was an initiator of the Mevlevi Sufi order, and he had a genuine interest in reform. Now let us turn precisely to that term, reform. I've already tried to make the important distinction between tajdeed and islah. Tajdeed, a concept which is fundamentally religious, although it ought to have consequences in the political sphere. Islah, reform. This is an essentially administrative, political, if you like, secular concept, not grounded either in the Quran or in the Hadith, which is not in any way to declare it illegitimate. I'm simply wishing to point out the circumstances of its origin. Islah originates in the late 18th century during the reign of Sultan Selim III as a general designation of governmental reform. Why don't you get it over with so I can continue lecturing? Islah, in this sense, is a simple borrowing from the political vocabulary of Europe. And one will see that almost all of the terminology, the political terminology, that is absorbed by the Ottomans and then passed on by the Ottomans to Iran and to other regions, is really a series of loan translations from European languages. So let us keep in mind that Islah is different from tajdeed. Although, as just pointed out, Selim III was encouraged to think that he was engaged in tajdeed as well. So that it seems there was some fudging of the two concepts already at that early point. The principal way in which Selim III attempted to go about the task of Islah was military reform. This was the most obvious key to the success of Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt. The construction of a professional army, well-trained, well-equipped with the latest weaponry imported from Europe, whereas the Ottoman army, for all of its historical glory, was increasingly a ramshackle affair, of recruits and officers who frequently arose against the central authority. So he established, pretty much on the lines of what Muhammad Ali Pasha had done in Egypt, what was called the Nizam-e-Jadid, Nizam-e-Jadid, or the new order. Nizam-e-Jadid. Interesting to note that this same measure and the term used to designate it was imitated within a decade in Iran also. So you can see that there's a kind of chain effect of these measures in various Muslim countries, from Egypt to Ottoman Turkey, from Ottoman Turkey to Iran. The Nizam-e-Jadid then was the establishment of a new military, properly trained by European officers, mostly from France and Italy, hired for the purpose, equipped with imported weaponry, and wearing identical uniforms. The concept of the uniform was not yet a standard. What doomed the project of the Nizam-e-Jadid was that it was allowed to, probably by force of circumstance, to coexist with the existing military institutions. Most importantly, the janissaries. Corps of professional soldiers or semi-professional soldiers that had once carried the Ottomans to the walls of Vienna, but were now in a state of serious decline and disorder. The janissaries resented the resources being invested in the Nizam-e-Jadid, and before long moved both against the Nizam-e-Jadid and its patron, Sultan Selim III. They poured into the palace, placed him under arrest, and then brought his cousin, Mustafa IV, to power. It is interesting to note that once the janissaries came in, Selim III thought that in accordance with well-established precedent, he will be immediately put to death. But his cousin, in a rare gesture of family solidarity, said, "No, don't worry, I will not allow you to be put to death." The reign of Mustafa IV, however, was to be extremely brief. Troops loyal to Selim III that had been busy fighting in the Balkans soon arrived in Istanbul and sought to depose Mustafa IV and bring Selim III out of his captivity. And they appeared at the gates of the palace saying, "Bring us forth, show us Selim III." Whereupon the janissaries inside the palace, who were holding him captive, beheaded him and threw the head outside the gates to the soldiers. However, Mustafa IV was also not long in power. He was overthrown and succeeded by Mahmud II, who ruled from 1808 to 1839. This was the last sort of bloody transfer of power among the Ottomans. And from then down to the end, in the second decade of the 20th century, transfers of power took place in a peaceful, if not entirely intrigue-free atmosphere. During the reign of Mahmud II, important measures of reform were undertaken. In 1829, a law was promulgated stipulating that all male subjects of the Sultan were to wear identical headgear. All male subjects of the Sultan were to wear identical headgear. You may wonder what is the point of this. However, in Ottoman, and as well as other traditional societies, headgear, form of headgear worn, might be an indicator, in fact would be an indicator of many different things. It would be an indicator of religion. Muslims, Christians and Jews would all wear turbans, but the color of the turban, the way in which the turban was bound might be significantly different. Then officers holding a certain rank in the civil service or the army would wear, again, turbans of a certain size, color, fashion, displaying their rank. And likewise, the religious scholars. The religious scholars in the Ottoman state also were graded in a quite sophisticated hierarchy, which will be indicated by their headgear. And members of the Sufi orders and so forth. Every Sufi order had its own different kind of turban. So the idea was to reduce the diversity of society by imposing, at least on all males, identical headgear. Like many of these early reform measures, it proved a dead letter, and people retained their various types of headgear until the very end of the Ottoman period, when under the Republic, all of them were abolished, it was made illegal, and instead hats of European type were strongly encouraged. There are other reasons as well, of course. European type hats, bowler hats, trilbies, whatever, they all have a peak or a rim, which prevents one from prostrating in prayer. And for that reason, many of the Ottoman scholars regarded the wearing of European hats as forbidden. And rather than obey the new law, which was, I think 1926, a fairly large number of them went to the gallows. So, which is one interesting part of the history of westernization in Turkey. And of course, if you look at pictures of Atatürk, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself chronologically, but still. Apart from this kind of sociological, political factor involved in imposing different types of hats on people, he himself seems to have had something of a hat fetish. There are pictures of him, absolutely every type of European headgear available. He was obviously experimenting. Anyhow, somewhat more significantly, in 1839, 10 years later, there is proclaimed what has entered Ottoman history as the noble rescript of Gülhane. The noble rescript. The English may make as much sense to you as the Turkish. Gülhane, literally the house of flowers. There was a conservatory on the grounds of the Topkapı Palace, which was devoted to growing roses, from which rose petal jam would be made for the sultans. But anyway, in addition to that, the Gülhane was chosen as the location for the proclamation of what is called the noble rescript. To be precise, this was on October the 3rd, 1839. This was extremely significant because this and subsequent measures were aimed at changing the relationship between the ruler and the entirety of his subjects. I've mentioned before that the Ottoman state should be regarded, at least in its at least down to the end of the 18th century, is a kind of a joint Christian and Muslim enterprise, in which, however, very plainly, the Muslims played the leading role. And there was a clear separation, not to say discrimination, between the Muslim and the non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan. From this time onwards, from the time of the Gülhane Act onwards, an attempt was made, very largely under European pressure, to change the whole nature of the relationship between the ruler and his subjects. This was done by attempting to minimize the civic and political significance of the Muslim, non-Muslim distinction. The non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan were, in a sense, indirectly his subjects. They were in the first place subordinate to their own communal or ecclesiastical authorities, who in turn were subject to, operated with the authority of, or under the authority of, the Ottoman Sultan. Whereas the relationship between the Muslim subjects and the Sultan was a more direct one. In other words, they owed him their obedience, theoretically, as the Caliph. And educational institutions were separate. The non-Muslim communities had their own internal system for the administration of justice, their own personal law, and so forth. And a very important point, the Ottoman state being, after all, one that was engaged in constant warfare, military service was the preserve of the Muslims, or was the burden placed exclusively on the Muslims, depending on how you look at it. According to this rescript promulgated in 1839, the Sultan of the day, namely Mahmud II, took it on himself to abolish any form of inequality among his subjects, which meant, effectively, although matters were not yet spelled out, the gradual effacement of all legal, administrative, political distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims, especially Christians. And at the same time also, he undertook to create justice among the totality of his subjects. These were broad promises, not yet implemented in specific measures. And the question arises, why should this far-reaching change, at least the beginnings of this far-reaching change, have arisen at this point? There are here a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, the growing European pressure. The European pressure on the Ottomans from the late 18th century onwards was not only military. In fact, it was increasingly diplomatic and political, and decreasingly military. And the European powers had an interest, in revising the very foundations of the Ottoman state. Of course, there is a certain hypocrisy in their call for equality among the Muslim and non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan, in that while other forms of distinction were to be erased, the European powers insisted upon the retention by the non-Muslim minorities of their own separate judicial system. And in addition to that, the non-Muslim minorities were by no means eager to undertake the military service, which now became open to them. In accordance with Islamic law, the non-Muslim minorities were exempted from military service in return for the payment of a tax known as the jizya. The poll tax. A tax levied on all adult, male, income-producing members of the community. And it serves essentially as a substitute for a military service. As a result of the Gülhane rescript, the non-Muslim minorities were no longer subject to the payment of the jizya, which meant that, logically speaking, they should have enrolled enthusiastically in the military, but they didn't. And this imbalance was protected by the European powers. A step forward in the implementation, at least of the idea beneath the Proclamation of Equality, came in 1856 with the proclamation of what is called the Imperial Rescript, Hat Humayun. It is interesting to note that the Hat Humayun was elaborated by a committee, one of the most active members of which was the British ambassador in Istanbul, a certain Stratford Canning. It is one mark of the growing weakness of the Ottomans at this relatively early point in the 19th century, that important matters of internal reform were decided upon with the active involvement of outsiders, particularly the British ambassador. On the 18th of February 1856, this new rescript was drawn up with a greater amount of detail than had been the case with the earlier document. Now the status of non-Muslim subjects was spelled out in detail to be identical to that of Muslim subjects. All of the schools that operated under the patronage of the state, including the newly founded military college, were to be open to all Ottoman citizens, irrespective of their religious affiliation. As for legal matters, legal disputes setting Muslims against non-Muslims, these have previously been within the competence of the Muslim courts. Now, however, mixed courts were established in order to adjudicate such cases with membership of both Christian and Muslim judges. Interestingly too, this measure provided for permission for foreign subjects to buy real estate. Permission was given out of foreign subjects to buy property. A matter entirely unconnected with the alleged aim of establishing equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. This became important towards the close of the 19th century when the Zionists began attempting to buy property in Palestine. As we shall see when we come to the reign of Sultan Abd-al-Hamid, he defeated a plan by the Zionists, by the then head of the Zionist movement, Herzl, simply to buy the entirety of Palestine outright. He sent him away with the prophetic remark that you don't need to buy it from me. Once I'm gone, you'll get it for free. But apart from that rebuttal made by Sultan Abd-al-Hamid, there was a certain piecemeal purchase of land made possible by this new provision. Next time I will talk about the third stage, or maybe a fourth stage in Ottoman political reform, the introduction of constitutionalism in 1876. But in advance of that, it is worthwhile pointing out that this entire effort made throughout the 19th century to change the bases of the state, at the behest largely of European powers, was doomed to failure. Because the attempt to create, as it were, an Ottoman nationality that superseded religious and cultural affiliation, bound, shall we say, Greeks and Armenians and Turks and Kurds and Arabs and Jews all together in a single loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. This was an artificial project that had no chance of success. and whatever move was made to construct an undifferentiated citizenry, this disturbed the Muslims. They did not regard the Sultan simply as the ruler in the European sense. They regarded him still as their caliph. And as for the Christian subjects, they wanted, egged on by the European powers, who were their patrons, they wanted progressively more. So this idea of a composite Ottoman nationality had really next to no chance of success. One interesting illustration of this is that towards the end of the 19th century, when the Ottomans got serious about conscripting Christians into the army, Greeks, Armenians and others, there was a wave of migration to North and South America. And many of the so-called Syrian communities that one finds in North America, Central and South America, in fact go back to that time. They came to the United States and South America on Ottoman passports, and were interestingly enough known as Turco, even though for the most part they are Arab. And they are refugees, as it were, but from what? Only from sharing the burden of military service in the Ottoman state. So I hope that despite my lingering malady, I've not been too incoherent today. I still don't have a new room. That I'm not responsible for. I'll continue my efforts to get one. Thank you.